I think all of this is an element of the heightened human rights due diligence that companies in Myanmar have been doing ever since the coup and even before, where they've needed to apply a conflict analysis to their operations. What is the impact of the conflict on the business and what is the impact of the business on the conflict?
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sager, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Vicky Bowman, who has been the director of the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business and also works with us here at IHRB. In this episode, you're going to hear about conscription, particularly when people are called up at short notice. My colleague Salil Tripathi has been looking into this. Let's hear his conversation with Vicky now.
So today we are going to talk about an issue that affects business in a context of armed conflict. Very often companies are caught in conflict and they find that they're in a situation where their staff, their workers, their executives might be called upon and work for the military or be part of the military apparatus in conscription, call it draft, call it recruitment, call it whatever you wish. And that has been going on for a while in several countries. Some countries have a mandatory requirement, such as Israel. Some countries call up reservists, as it has happened in Ukraine and Russia, and so on. So let's start with a country that has been having an endemic conflict for a long time, but tends to get off the map and radar screen, and that is Myanmar. Vicky Bowman, my colleague and friend, who has been with us at the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, which she founded, she has followed the situation in Myanmar extremely closely. Vicky, my question is this: what happened? Well, what is the conscription situation in Myanmar?
So what happened is that in the middle of February 2024, the Myanmar military suddenly announced that they were going to activate a dormant conscription law and put it into immediate effect. And this was largely off the back of the fact that they were running out of troops due to casualties, defections, and a lack of anyone wanting to voluntarily join up. For a while, they'd already been press ganging young people, including prisoners, and also trying to boost their numbers with some local militias, including local criminals. But they now decided to make this official by introducing conscription for men aged between 18 to 35 and women aged between 18 to 27, at least in principle.
And just so that our listeners know this, Myanmar, of course, has been having an endemic conflict, which basically talks about insurgencies within the country. Am I right?
That's right. So since the military coup, which took place on the 1st of February 2021, there have been heightened fighting around the borders of Myanmar, which has been largely ethnic driven. But it also is a conflict which is now pitting the people against the army, regardless of their ethnicity. And many young people, particularly from Generation Z, had gone to the jungles in mid-2021 and were fighting back against the military and making significant gains, which is why the military decided to enforce the conscription law.
But it is the case, right, that it is not unusual for a government to require military service.
It isn't unusual, but it's the first time that this has been enacted in Myanmar. It's quite true that if you look, there are some 85 countries worldwide that have conscription, and that includes a number of European countries. But in most cases, conscription and military service is voluntary rather than mandatory. And usually it's less than a year, whereas in Myanmar, it was going to be 2 years minimum. The other thing is that even in South Korea, for example, which has mandatory military service, although it recently exempted K-pop stars, along with Olympic medalists, from taking part, even where it is mandatory, the difference with what was going on in Myanmar is that, first of all, you have an army which is not engaged in national defense, but actually engaged in a civil war against its own people. And the introduction of conscription in Myanmar was completely sudden and chaotic and had a massive psychological effect on young people who were being put into a position where they would be fighting against their friends. So looking at comparators around the world, really, Russia was the only one that I could see which had any comparison where you equally there have an army which is engaged in war crimes. And that's where I was looking for any lessons that could be learned from the Russian experience, including what it meant for companies.
Right. So we are joined today also by Nabi Abdullaev. He's from Control Risk, which is a risk management consultancy that assists international organizations and businesses and even civil society groups to identify risks and taking steps to mitigate those. And he has been following the whole situation about conscription and Russia in the wake of this conflict rather closely and has been monitoring that. So my first question to you, Nabi, is what has been happening in Russia since the conscription notices came? What has led Russia to this situation where it has to call up people?
So the massive conscription, a massive mobilization started in September 2022 when it became clear that the military campaign in Ukraine is stalling. So the plan was to draft around 250,000 people. As a result of this campaign, more than 1 million people, by different accounts, young men, fled Russia. And mainly people from educated urbanite class, a lot of them IT specialists, those who actually could afford to flee Russia and settle somewhere else. It became quite clear to the authorities that the effort was organizationally botched. So within several weeks, it kind of died down. And from that time, we don't see any mass mobilization. The authorities adopted the approach of contracting young men, and sometimes not so young, to fight in Ukraine, and also by keeping those who are being drafted for the regular army service. Every 6 months, Russia announces a draft. And for example, this draft that was announced several days ago, Russia plans to bring in 150,000 draftees into the army. Some of them will stay and will fight in Ukraine.
Yeah, and just to put it in context, I just checked that there are apparently the standing army strength of Russia is just over 1 million, and there are about several more reservists, right? So this is in addition to that they are getting.
It's now at 1,150,000, and there is a plan to grow it to 1.5 million within the next several years. Army or defense and armed forces is something different. So there is a lot of admin personnel, a lot of supplementary services, not people who are actually carrying the guns and do the direct show fighting.
So when companies are being called up, are those people being called to fight the war, or are they performing the supportive roles, the conscripted people?
So the idea was actually to send people into the battle after very quick, like 3-4 weeks training, and which happened to quite a few of who actually were drafted and couldn't escape the draft. It was about the same time Russian warlord Evgeny Prigozhin started of the Wagner Group started massive recruitment in the Russian prisons, and by different accounts he managed to recruit around 50,000 people, and they were being sent into the fighting very often without any necessary preparation or necessary training. So this was the time when Russia was fighting for the city called Bakhmut, and it became kind of a symbolic city like Stalingrad during the Second World War, and they needed to take it. And so they were not actually saving people or material in order to do this. And a lot of people, tens of thousands of people, died during the attack on Bakhmut.
And how have the companies reacted to it, and what has been the impact on them? To what extent it is compulsory? Is there a discretion involved?
So, in Russia, men of conscription age can be called up into the army when the government wants to call them up, like including myself. There is only age limit to this. But even this age limit is not sometimes respected. There were reports about people above the age limit being drafted, or even people with really poor health, with all the certificates confirming that they are not fit, they were still brought into the army. The authorities need to issue a call-up notice and to hand it to you. But the thing is, a lot of Russians, particularly young people, are not living at the places where they are registered. Every person in Russia needs to have a registration at a certain address. And for young people, it can be a place of where their parents live. But since you are moving, so an enlistment officer comes to your parents, but you are not there. And so the Russian law is such that you need to actually hand over the paper document to a draftee. And since this moment, he is obliged to show up at the enlistment office within a certain period of time, like 3 days or whatever. And if he doesn't appear, he is criminally liable. So in order to find people, the government came up with an idea to oblige companies or employers to distribute these call-up notices. So what would happen? An enlistment officer would come to an office of a company, give a bunch of call-up notices and say now to the director or to whoever meets them, someone from management, and say, now it's your responsibility to distribute these documents to draftees. And here we saw quite a wide array of reactions from the companies. You cannot push back because there is a law and you can be punished for openly saying, no, I'm not doing this. Some companies did the following thing. Because this war started after the COVID took place in Russia, and like every year, there was already a developed system of remote working. So the management would take these notices, say, okay, we will notify our employees, but they will call the employees and say, listen, we will issue a backdated order for you to work remotely, like 2 weeks behind, and you just leave Russia for the time being. They did not violate the law. They did what the government expected from them, but they would not hand them. So without the physical handover of the document, there is no liability for a draftee to show up. Yeah, this is kind of one type of response. In some cases, we saw that companies were in fact distributing them. It depends upon the size of the company, the perception of risk, of fear of the authorities. And we saw situations when quite a few companies, like big important companies like IT corporations or banks or companies involved in military industry, they would immediately kind of mobilize the lobbying potential and start writing letters to the government saying, to the presidential administration saying, listen, pulling out our people from work is not good for the Russian economy, especially during the military time. So please give them a waiver. And at some extent, for example, in the IT industry, the government minister, Maksud Shaidaev, said, no IT guys will go. And so he managed to kind of get an industry-wide waiver for IT professionals in Russia so that they are not being called up. But as I said, the pushback was so strong, and also the exodus of qualified workforce out of Russia was so visible at this moment that the government rolled back quite quickly. I think they started in mid-September 22. 2 months later, this campaign quietly died out.
Right. No, I think that's fascinating that it's creative and innovative ways in which the companies did push back to mitigate the impact, and there was some flexibility. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, Vicky, as we heard from Nabi, the situation is slightly different and has a different approach in dealing with conscription. Is that a fair assessment compared to Myanmar?
So I think the commonality is the massive psychological impact that conscription has had both on people in Russia and people in Myanmar. And as with Russia, the numbers that were leaving the country after the announcement of conscription were far greater than the numbers of actual conscripts that the respective governments were looking for. So what we saw in Myanmar was immediately a rush to the exits. We saw people queuing up round the corner for visas to Thailand. We saw others heading to cross the border illegally. And this wasn't just the individuals who were targeted, their families were telling them to get out. And it was quite clear that this was having a significant effect, not just on the individuals, but also on the economy more generally. So we saw, for example, that people didn't want to go out at night. They didn't want to do overtime, and that particularly hit some of the factories in the garment sector. They were scared to travel. And in some cases, rather than hanging around to join the army or potentially join the army, they actually went off and joined the resistance movement themselves. And this was all against a background where, in any case, the passport office had been overwhelmed by a sort of post-COVID, post-coup desire to leave the country. And you ended up with a rise in corruption as people sought to get passports, but also a rise in corruption as people sought to get their names taken off lists, such that a few weeks after the announcement was made, we even saw an announcement that you were not allowed to change your date of birth on your official records, except by going through Naypyidaw, which was a fairly clear reflection of the fact that people had been trying to increase their age so as to make themselves exempt from service.
Yeah, Naypyidaw, of course, is the capital of Myanmar, which is rather inaccessible, so it's not very simple.
Indeed, it is. So as a result, really the economy has significantly suffered from this, as well as the people. And I think it's very typical that the Myanmar army, the Tatmadaw, didn't think at all about what the economic impacts would be of this decision. So what we've seen is a economy which anyway was struggling to retain skilled workers because most of them had quit the country to go and work in Singapore or Thailand or in the Gulf. So people in IT, in finance and so on. So these were now, if they were still left in the country, they were heading for the hills or heading for the airport. And there was a survey done by Eurochan Myanmar about 2 weeks after the announcement, which found that some companies were reporting as many as 50% of their white-collar and blue-collar workers were resigning, had resigned in the first couple of weeks. And certainly it was quite common for companies to be seeing resignation rates of 5 to 10%. So really significant for the economy and for businesses' ability to operate. And then, obviously, even for those who weren't resigning, they were hugely scared, demotivated. So companies were having to consider what they could do to make things better for the employees and, to some extent, reduce the risks for them.
Has the military had any kind of rethink? Does it realize that it has made a mistake?
So I think there is a certain realization that this was badly handled. And soon after the announcement was made, the military started saying that it wasn't actually interested in employing women, or at least not in the first few batches. It started to send round SMSs on the telecoms operators to say, if you want the true facts, you can get them from here. And indeed, it claimed that a lot of people's fears were down to misinformation, which I don't think was true at all. Now they seem to be stressing the fact that the people who are being called up are volunteers. Now, I think that's questionable because in the current environment of great threat, if somebody sticks a form in front of you and tells you to fill it up and it has a question saying, are you volunteering or not, it can be quite difficult for an individual to say no. But it does seem that this point about voluntary service is their attempt perhaps to reassure people. And at the same time, it also, I think, offers some kind of a at least temporary relief in that companies have been told informally that if they want to appeal or put forward a case that their employee should not be conscripted, then the employee, to start off with, needs to have said that they're not volunteering for service.
And how many companies are being dragged into this, and what are their counter strategies?
So fortunately, so far, it doesn't seem like Russia in that companies are not being put on the spot by recruiting sergeants coming around to serve papers on employees. All of this is being done outside of the workplace, outside of companies. But clearly, the impacts are having a huge impact on the workforce. So we've seen companies trying to establish the facts, set up information sessions for their employees, put into place mental welfare, counselling services, psychological support. In some cases where they weren't already doing so, and many of them were because of wider security risks, they've been putting on transportation to and from the workplace. And there was a very strong request for workers who were working overtime and late shifts to not do that, even though they needed the money, because not least family members were worrying when their family members didn't come home until late from the workplace. And then in some cases where it's been possible, there have been requests and companies have arranged for staff to work remotely, including to go overseas. In some cases, they simply found that their staff rang up and said, I'm in Bangkok now. So generally, they're looking and building on the experience of COVID, flexible working arrangements so that staff can work in a place that they feel more safe. But in all of this, companies are very, very aware that there is a clause in the law which puts companies, or those within companies who might be accused of helping people with draft dodging, that makes them criminally liable. So that's something which companies are being cautious about. They are, though, trying to provide staff with things like letters showing that they are employed full-time or part-time, that they are paying income tax, social security. And these are letters which have no legal weight, but they're perhaps a sort of source of reassurance or a security blanket for staff. And embassies, some of them have done something similar. Because I think the key thing that companies feel is that they should be able to in some way make the case that sending these people off to fight would be bad, not only for the individual, but for the wider economy.
And if you were to help a company draft a kind of a plan, what they should do, what would that contain?
So I think all of this is an element of the heightened human rights due diligence that companies in Myanmar have been doing ever since the coup and even before, where they've needed to apply a conflict analysis to their operations. What is the impact of the conflict on the business, and what is the impact of the business on the conflict? So already I've given you a few of the examples of where companies have been taking action to keep employees safer, to keep them, at least reassure them in some ways. And I think one of the most important things is to just maintain a constant dialogue with employees, both collectively and individually, to understand what their concerns are and where a company might be able to. And then look ahead, both by learning from other companies, and that's where it's really important to have organisations like the European Chamber of Commerce who can sort of share experience and provide updates and briefings. Look ahead to what potential scenarios there might be where a company's staff would need to react quickly or carefully. So one such might be, for example, if companies were being asked for information about employees. At the time of the conscription announcement, there were companies who had been participating in a pilot scheme to roll out EID, sort of smart card ID. And so this was, in some employees' minds, mixed up with the draft. So what I recommended was that companies should withdraw from that voluntary scheme, because it was obviously something where employees didn't want to be providing any information to anyone which might find its way into the hands of government. Another risk which I do see is potentially real is that companies might be called upon to make donations to, or quote, donations in inverted commas, to cover the cost of conscription. And the reason I say this is twofold. One is that we're already seeing this at the township level, where households are being told that they should pay $3 a month, 10,000 chat, to sponsor the cost of volunteers from their so-called volunteers from their townships. But we've seen in the past, under previous military regimes, and indeed after the Rohingya crisis, that it's been quite common for the military to turn to companies and ask them to donate for particular projects. In the days of the Rohingya, it was sort of relief to the soldiers and to build a border wall, and that led to a very significant report that was done by the UN about the role that companies had in potentially supporting the conflict. So I think this is a live risk for companies, which for some will be an absolute red line if the military comes around with the cap and says put money in this. And the first thing companies at least should be doing is pushing back and asking for requests to be made in writing and citing the relevant law, which of course there isn't one, and under which such requests are being made.
Right. And I suppose it also doesn't help with the flux of migrant workers going out and also the supply chains within Myanmar, I take it.
That's right. I mean, I think in particular, this is going to push more workers to be migrating irregularly, to arrive in Thailand, Malaysia without documents, and that will make them more vulnerable. And so even where companies, and I'm talking here about multinationals, don't have a Myanmar presence and therefore might think that this isn't relevant to them, they should be looking to see whether or not they have Myanmar migrant workers within their supply chains in Thailand, in Malaysia, even in Korea, Japan, the Gulf, which are all destinations for Myanmar migrant workers, and looking to see that those workers are not in bonded labour, looking at the recruitment channels, because we've seen many recruitment channels which are demanding significant amounts of money from workers looking to migrate. So they need to understand more about the vulnerability and the risks of those migrant workers in those supply chains in surrounding countries. And we're also likely within Myanmar to see more child workers because there will be labour shortages and there is huge increased poverty, and that those two naturally lead to more under 18s going into supply chains.
Yeah, and my final question, and as you know, and many of us know, forecasting and prediction is always very hard, particularly about the future. So where do we go next?
I think it's incredibly difficult to predict what's going to be happening in Myanmar over the coming months or even the coming weeks. And we're in the middle of a very live conflict. So all I can hope for is that companies will continue to be able to operate against very challenging circumstances, both caused by conscription, but also other factors such as security and lack of power. Because if they leave, in the case of multinationals, I think it will be very difficult for them to turn around and come back in should there be a more positive political change. So that's really why Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business has, for the last 3 years, been doing what it can to support companies to understand the risks, to mitigate them, to work collectively on them, rather than taking what could be seen as the easy route out and just deciding to responsibly or irresponsibly exit the country.
Thank you so much, Vicky. It's not an easy time, not an easy situation, and companies are finding it hard to operate there, and you put it very vividly. Thank you.
Thank you, Salil.
That was Vicky Bowman there, speaking to my colleague Salil Tripathi. You've been listening to Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.